Hello everybody, and welcome to a new video. This will be a video on React. I know that most of you that have followed along have probably figured out that I am an Angular developer, and especially if you follow me on Twitter, I'm always retweeting things from Angular, but today it's React. And you may ask, why React? Why not Angular? Well, React is very popular. I've recently started using React with the Customizer UI plugin for WordPress version 2, which is almost complete. And I wanted to share some things that I've learned. So in today's video, I wanted to talk about React hooks and how you can use it to separate your application logic from your display code. So right here, I've just got a basic Create React app. I've got it opened up in WebStorm on the left, and we've got the browser on the right. So let's jump in and do some coding. The first thing we're going to do is go into our app.js and just delete everything that's in here. Go. And we're going to create our first component. I'm going to create a folder called components, and we'll call this first one counter. All right, so let's go ahead and create our first class component, and then we're going to use hooks to make it a lot more readable and maintainable. We're going to have our class counter. It's going to extend React component, and we need to go ahead and import React. And within any React component, we're going to have a constructor, and we're going to have a render method. And this render is going to render out just a simple button, and it will have count in it. Let's go back to our app.js and go ahead and add this in here. And we're getting a little error here because we need to also export counter. Here we go. So we have our button. Let's make this a little bit bigger here. And nothing happens. So let's go into our counter function here. And first, let's make this, this value actually be wired up to something. Let's go ahead and create state that we can wire up to our button. And all we're going to have in here is our count. And now we can change this to this.state.count. See the same thing. Just to make sure it's working, we can change our initial state to 5. That seems to be updating just fine. And we're also going to need a function called increment. And this is going to set state equal to count plus 1. Let's go back into our button here and do an on click. And we're going to call increment. See if this works. All right, perfect. So just to review, we have our button. It displays the current state's count. And when you click it, it calls the increment function. Increment updates the state by setting the count equal to the current state count and adding 1. Now, this isn't super complicated, but you can see how quickly this can become kind of out of control if you have a really complicated component. So what I'd like to do is make this a little bit simpler, and we're going to use our first React hook, which is setState. Now let's create a function component that will use the useState hook and compare it to this much larger class here. We're going to have a function, and we're going to call it counter, because this is going to replace our class in a moment. And any functional component is just going to simply return our HTML here. I'm going to go ahead and comment this out. Save it. And we're back to having a button with just a 0. Since a functional component doesn't have state, we're going to use the useState function to kind of create the same thing. So useState is a hook, and what it gives us is an array that we can then pull a few things off of. The array has 2 objects. First is the value that we're going to be using. We're going to call that count. And the second thing is a function to update the state of that value. We're going to call it setCount. So if we go in here, we can change this now to count and give our useState function the initial value, which is, let's say 5 in this case, just to make sure it's working. And if I save, the button now says 5. Clicking it doesn't do anything. Let's turn that back to 0, and let's create a new function. We're going to call it increment. And this is going to be an anonymous function. And what it's going to do is it's going to call setCount, which we got from the useState hook, and pass it the current count plus 1. And now in our return statement, we can just take our button and say on click, increment. Save it. Let's see if it works. Now we have these 3 lines of code which replace this entire class. That's a lot simpler to deal with, right? So this is really, really good. We can get rid of this class. And this is very readable. And for a simple component like this, you would be perfectly happy with it. But we can go a step further and abstract out all the application logic into our own custom hook. Now for a component like this, you probably wouldn't do this, but it'd be good to go through the practice of checking it out. Let's create a new file. I'm going to say new folder called hooks, and we're going to say use counter. Now our custom hook is just simply a function, and it's going to return an object. That's all we need to do to create our custom hook. So what we want to do is we want to take the increment and this whole useState section out of our component and move it into our custom hook. Let's cut that out. We don't need this import anymore. And let's go over to our use counter. All right, so we have our useState, we have our increment, and we have our return object. Let's return both the count and the increment, as we're going to need that in our component. We don't need the set count because we're using that within increment. So now within our counter component, we can simply say const and then an object, and we're going to destructure that from our counter. Let's go ahead and import that. Let's go over to our use counter and make sure we export it. And import it into our component. Remember, we need to destructure this, so we get a couple things. We get the count, and we get increment. Since we named them the same, this is already wired up, and let's see if it works. It does. So with one line, we took all the application logic and moved it up into this use counter hook. And the use counter did just what we did before in our functional component. We have our useState, which handles the current count and the update count, or the set count function. We have our increment function, which just uses set count, update the count by adding 1 to it. And then we just return this object. In our functional component, we destructure it and pass it right into our return statement. You can see here, this component is simply just the display, what we're actually seeing on the DOM. All the actual application logic has been moved out and abstracted into our use counter hook. Well, I hope you found this interesting and helpful. If you'd like to see me create more complex hooks with more complex components, let me know in the comments below. And be sure to subscribe so you get notified on every new video. Thanks for watching.